Welcome to the Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College. I'm your host, Peter Cepeda. On today's episode, we have the California missions, the Chinese immigration, and mining in California. When we think of the American history of the West, we mostly think of the English-speaking people's quest of moving westward, bringing civilization and industrialization. We often don't acknowledge other people who ventured into the vast western regions of North America. The achievements of other explorers and settlers often only exist in the names. We see this with the French names like Boise and Grand Tetons. We see that western states like California and Nevada were given Spanish names, yet the people who name them get little recognition. Non-English speaking Europeans had already gone west. We can even see their activity today, especially in the missions of California. Today, you can go to California and see the many missions. It is amazing that some of these missions were established before the time the U.S. had declared its independence. Others were established when America was gaining their independence. Recently, some members of my family visited some of these missions. I have a picture of my 8-year-old nephew standing in robes that almost fit perfect for him. My family had also visited the mission of San Carlos, where Saint Junipero Serra was buried. These missions stand today, a testament to the achievements of a forgotten chapter in America's history of the West. They number 21 in total. These buildings were often white walls and red tile roofs. The chapels are very narrow compared to other churches. This is due to the friars not understanding trussing. One such mission, San Antonio de Padua, resembles another mission, the Alamo in Texas, particularly the front of the mission, which shares the same shape as the mission in Texas. The mission also features a courtyard. This courtyard is rather plain, housing rocks and ornamental grasses due to the lack of water. Simplicity is a theme in the California missions. The missions of California are not as ornate as the ones of Arizona and Texas. In those missions, you see the decorations typically found in Spanish Baroque and the ornamentation passed down by the Moors. This simplicity of the missions reflects the poverty of the Franciscans who made them. Or it may be because California was harder to access from Mexico. San Carlos Carmel mission has 2 short bell towers. One features a dome. This mission is also the site where Junipero Serra erected a wooden cross. The cross which stands today is a replica. No one was maybe as important to understanding the missions as Junipero Serra. He had built 9 missions and is credited for 5,880 converts. This estimate comes from a history of Junipero Serra written by Friar Francisco Palo, written in 1787. In this book, he writes about Junipero Serra like he was a juniper who gave shade over his companions. Fitting, since Junipero means juniper in Spanish. In this document, you will find that the California is referred to as a peninsula. This is interesting since California used to be thought as an island. He also writes of the natives describing them as barbarians. It was not that the Indians of California were violent, they were actually peaceful. What shocked the Spanish was that they were naked. living a lifestyle similar to the Bushmen of Africa. Despite the controversy surrounding Junipero Serra, nearly every historian credits Serra for defending the Indians from the cruelty of the conquistadors. Junipero Serra even traveled to Mexico City on foot to petition for better treatment of the natives. He did this journey on foot with a swollen leg. He had ever since suffering from a snake bite. It is also important to note that when the Indians did flee the missions, they fled mostly to the cities where there was drink. Junipero Serra was canonized in 2015. Even though Serra was a champion for the Indians, he is disrespected. Statues of the great man have been defaced in 2015. Someone decapitated a statue of him in Monterrey. Just one instance of a long series of vandalization. Here we have a tale of two types of peoples. One is brave enough to walk 2,000 miles on behalf of the downtrodden, and the other so cowardly that they destroy statues of a man that are no longer present on Earth. Very few people actually want to go in depth. All that people want to know about Serra is that he was a colonizer, but they don't explain that 18th century Spanish colonization entailed. This entailed not retaliating after the Indians burnt the first mission of San Diego. This was a different colonization in the 16th century, and Spanish civil colonization is very different from the English colonization. Later Spanish colonization in North America was more focused on missions, more so than English colonization. The Spanish monarchy would even support friars over the conquistadors. The natives were seen as Spanish subjects. The English did not see natives the same way. It may be true that Spain did not always live up to their standards, but they had standards that allowed for assimilation. When we talk about the California missions, we are talking about later missions, even though many of these missions were built before America had declared independence. There were some built in Arizona and New Mexico before. These missions are credited to another remarkable man like Junipero Serra, Eusebi Kino, a Jesuit, where Serra was a Franciscan, born in Tyrol, a border region between Italy and the German-speaking Austria. It is believed that he wanted to travel to China, and that's where the name Kino came from. But it's also debated that his real name was the German name Kuhn, but it was changed to Kino to Italianize it. Not only is the origins of his name interesting, but so was what he did in northern Mexico and the southwest United States. He had established missions amongst the Pimas Indians. In March of 1695, the Pimas destroyed the homes and killed his fellow missionaries. This was a problem for Kino, not just because he was in danger, but because his previous conclusions that the Pimas were not allies with the warring Apaches were possibly wrong. He had previously been denounced in Mexico for not indicating whether the Pimas were indeed allies with the Apache. Kino waited for his death when the revolt spread to the missions, but the revolt never came to him. The revolt was quickly crushed by the Spanish soldiers. The Pimas sued for peace, and the missionaries pardoned them. Kino would eventually be proven right that there was no alliance between the Pimas and the Apache because the Indians displayed their Apache scalps. Kino inherited a horrible situation when it came to the conversion of the natives. After the events of the spring of 1695, Kino went to Mexico City and told of the cruelty of the Spanish before and after the revolt. One such claim was that 3 Pimas with meat were put to death for cattle rustling. Later it was discovered that the meat they were carrying was venison and not beef. He also went against and reversed the stupid policy of forcing the converts to work where the unconverted Indians were free to go about the Spanish settlements. Before Serra traveled to Mexico City to protest the treatment of the natives, Kino would also travel to that city before him. Kino would influence the missions of California in other ways. English pirates such as Francis Drake were now threatening Spanish holdings in the Pacific. California was at a serious threat. Although the Spanish claimed the land, there was no settlements or any way to protect California from the English. This prompted Kino to make an expedition north, along the Colorado River, to find its mouth and a clear path to California. Kino rode on horseback, guided by Indians, at the age of 67. It was thought that California was the largest island in the world, but when Kino reached the mouth of the river, it was discovered that California was in fact a peninsula. He mapped the region, creating the first accurate map of the area. The development of California missions may have been very different or may not have happened without him. Father Kino became known as the Padre on horseback. He became very familiar with horses. He would ride to various missions in the Sonora and Arizona. At one time, he raced across the country to stop an execution of an Indian. He also introduced cattle to the Southwest. He raised them to feed his missions. No wonder why Kino is in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. The people like Kino and Serra led to the development of the West more than almost anyone else did. They built the first buildings where the U.S. was gaining independence. They converted the natives. They mapped the unknown regions. It was the Spanish missions that brought horses, sheep, and cows to the land, which would become valuable to the cowboys of the Southwest U.S. The picture of the West is hard to imagine without them, since they have brought so much into the development of the West, yet they get so little recognition.
Thank you, Peter, for your insights into the Spanish missions of the West. Now for something a little different, as I would like to speak of Western migration, as everyone should be aware that American history is a story of Westward migration. Since Americans first landed upon the shores of North America, they have found reasons for leaving home and traveling west. The search for a new place, whether for wealth or freedom, is a part of our shared national identity. Even though Western migration is an important part of U.S. history, many people are only aware of it through fictional accounts in film. Histories in film are often only partially correct or completely false. The account told today is from the journal of Stephen Chapman David. Stephen was born February 16, 1833, in Massachusetts, but his family quickly moved to Nashua, New Hampshire. While in Nashua, he would hold a variety of jobs ranging from being a worker in a textile mill to being a cabin boy on a ship. In the early 1850s, Stephen would eventually turn his gaze west and travel multiple times to California and back by boat, with a short walk across the Isthmus of Panama. Stephen would later travel to Europe in 1854 to ply his merchant trade, but would die in 1856, having led a full life and leaving a fascinating journal. His account provides a first-hand view of what it was like to take part in the journey into the gold fields in search of opportunity. In July 1850, Stephen and his brother Josiah left New York with California as their goal. The newspapers at the time were telling everyone far and wide that gold had been discovered in Sutter's Mill in California. This caused a gold rush which lasted from the tail end of the 1840s and through much of the 1850s. There were two main routes to California, overland or by boat. In 1849, 25,000 to 30,000 gold seekers traveled by land and 40,000 traveled by boat. The brothers chose to risk the dangers of an ocean voyage. They sailed down the coast of the United States and then traversed the Isthmus of Panama before progressing up the west coast of California. The trip to Panama was not easy or convenient for Stephen. A storm threatened to sink the ship. The ship began to fill with water. Those aboard bailed the ship, and thanks to their efforts, it was saved, even though the winds and waves had done great damage. The rest of the journey was relatively easy, and Stephen was able to sell some New York newspapers that he had brought on the trip. He also managed to find some employment at a newspaper printing office, which would help him pass his time during his stay in Panama. This turned out to be well timed, as the bane of all travelers occurred when the luggage did not arrive on time. Stephen had to wait for the luggage while his brother went on without him to get a head start in California. The stay in Panama was short-lived, however, and Stephen was able to board a ship headed north toward the gold fields. While staying along the Mexican coast, another danger of the time reared its ugly head: cholera. Fortunately, Stephen was not harmed and arrived in San Francisco on September 4th. Another modern misconception is that everyone who went to California for the gold rush took a mining claim. While there is some truth to that, there was a variety of work to be done, as Stephen quickly learns when he arrives to find his brother employed as a carpenter, making $5 a day. During the gold rush, buildings were in constant need of repair. Not only were many buildings poorly constructed, but fires also often destroyed sections of the towns. Stephen, however, did not follow his brother's path. Instead, he continued to sell the newspapers from New York that he had brought on his journey and newspapers he purchased in San Francisco. Eventually, both brothers tried their hands at mining, but the reality of mining did not live up to the fantasy. Stephen writes in his journal that they started to prospect a certain flat nearby that was supposed to be rich, but after a hard afternoon's work, were doomed to be totally disappointed in this, our first experience in mining. What they saw in the pan was a wake-up call to the difficulty of the work. The weather was scalding hot, and as Stephen wrote, "We find it no easy task to ply the pick and bend over the pan." The brothers' fortunes turned around quickly. After meeting an acquaintance from their trip to California, they purchased a supply store that increased their ability to get ahead on more than the strength of their backs. At this point, Stephen records an activity that might surprise many 21st century readers, as the brothers' first task was to sew a tent for their store. This enabled them to quickly be up and operating. Now the brothers had another way of making money. Stephen operated the store while Josiah continued the quest for gold. This is not enough for Stephen. He decides to branch out into the mail system, bringing miners' mail from the mining camps to San Francisco. This not only turned a profit, but also paid for the trip into San Francisco, which enabled Stephen to buy cheaper supplies for the store. While mail delivery may now seem like such a small thing, it was important to the miners. As Stephen wrote that upon his return, the miners dropped their tools and run to meet me in haste to get the letters from their dear friends at home. And those who are so unfortunate as to receive no letters frequently rate their friends at home most severely for neglecting so important a duty. And as they look upon their fellow miners who are more fortunate, reading epistles of friendship and consistency penned in the fine hand of a female, frequently a tear comes and bends the eye, while the heart grieves at being thus forgotten by loved ones at home. but sometimes the letter bears a black seal, and I have seen the recipient of such a missive convulsively grasping a lock of hair it bore, uttering lamentations as sobbing as only one can when he has lost one whose affection and happiness were closely entwined and almost inseparable with his own. It is apparent by their action of the miners that they were not unfeeling or disconnected from those who they had left behind. Black seals signified a death in the family, and in an era before widespread photography, a lock of hair served as a reminder of the loved ones. Miners were deeply affected by the choices that they made for themselves and their distance from loved ones. As if life was not hard enough, there were also cases of robbery, not of bank or stagecoaches, but rather the theft of a pick or a person's savings. Stephen does not report any vigilante justice in his journal. Instead, when people learned of these crimes, the perpetrators were allowed to go on their way with a warning. This may not have always been the case, but it shows that people of this time and place don't fit the popular image of the Old West. Stephen and Josiah decided to leave California and try their luck in mining in Oregon. Again, Josiah moved first, to be followed by Stephen. They sold the store in preparation to move. After sailing to Portland, Oregon, Stephen found his brother disillusioned with mining in Oregon and wished to return to California. However, on their return to California, they decided that they had been gone from New York long enough and it was time to go home. The trip was largely uneventful until they arrived on the Caribbean side of the Isthmus, where the brothers became involved in an uprising of blacks against whites. Those who were traveling became stuck while waiting for transport. After the uprising was quelled, they were able to get transport and be on their way. Once they made it home, Josiah became a farmer, but Stephen returned to California. After arriving in San Francisco, Stephen set about settling his accounts and started to once again to engage in commerce. In his travels, Stephen wrote about encountering a site that is an excellent example of what drove people into the West and filled their imaginations. As we arrived in sight of Page's Ranch, which is situated in a valley surrounded by towering hills, while a clear, limpid brook gurgled along through the park-like grounds by the house and was soon lost in the forest beyond. While surveying the scene and drinking in the loveliness of the landscape with my wondering eyes, I thought it a paradise on earth, as the very place my imagination had pictured to me in younger days, as the realization of all the airy castles I had built in my romantic spells, where I would live and die, away from the selfish, wicked world, in some retired spot, some lovely dell, where nature has lavished all her charms, where the air is filled with the perfume of 1,000 flowers, and where the sweet warblings of multitudes of beautiful feathered songsters combine to make it a residence more suitable for angels than for men. Stephen, however, does not linger here, even with the beauty before him. He goes about his business of buying and selling newspapers and books. Contrary to popular misconceptions of Westerners, his wares were well received in the mining camps. At this point, the business did well enough that he was able to invest in several different mines, build a new house, and enjoy the fruits of his labor. In the West, change came quickly, and for Stephen it was no different. He received word from his family that his brother was sick, and shortly after he learned of his brother's death. This was to be the end of his time in the West, as he remarked that when he heard of his brother Josiah's death, which came upon me so sudden and afflicting, that I desired to be with my friends and kindred, and not be a wonder in this cold and wicked world. In the same way that Stephen Chapman David left the West for home, so does the reader leave his story and return to the modern world with a certain amount of sadness, but also a more complete vision of what the West was like at this time. The West allowed opportunities to those who were willing to risk their lives to attain what it offered.
Thank you for that story, Jeff. From an account of white prospectors going to California, we move on to Chinese immigrants looking to do the same. When people think of Chinese immigration to the United States in the 1800s, the two most common things that typically come to mind are settling in California and building the Transcontinental Railroad. While those certainly are significant parts of history, they are not the only things that the Chinese did in the American West. Chinese immigrants traveled and settled wherever work could be found, and tried to carve out their own communities and opportunities wherever they could. Their presence in the West is frequently ignored, if not outright rejected, and their part in history has been largely forgotten. But in places such as Idaho, they were key to making the state as prosperous as it was. During the mid-19th century, China was in dire straits. The Qing dynasty was struggling to deal with internal and external pressures. Foreign nations like Great Britain were interfering in Chinese politics and markets. Racial, religious, and political tensions were high. The country was suffering from famines, and the Taiping Rebellion between 1850 and 1864 left millions dead or destitute. However, people found options. News coming from across the Pacific reported that gold was being found in California, and that everyone was making a fortune. Chinese men took the chance and sailed to San Francisco in hopes of getting the money they needed to survive at home. Besides mining for gold, the Chinese found other job opportunities. White labor organizers were happy to discover that Chinese laborers would work jobs white workers would not, with more effort and for less money. Labor companies began advertising directly to the Chinese immigrants and focused on them specifically as their target demographic. In his book Frontier History Along Idaho's Clearwater River, John Bradbury gives this example of one such advertisement from Hong Kong in the early 1860s. Americans are very rich people. They want the Chinaman to come and make him very welcome. There you will have great pay, large houses, and food and clothing of the finest description. You can write to your friends, or send them money at any time, and we will be responsible for the safe delivery. It is a nice country, without mandarins or soldiers. All alike, big man, no larger than little man. Money is in great plenty and to spare in America. Such as wish to have wages and labor guaranteed can obtain the surety by application at this office. When word got back to China about these employment opportunities, migration increased substantially. Eventually, the Chinese in San Francisco formed large and distinct communities, managed by an association of Chinese merchants called the Six Companies. The Six Companies helped Chinese migrants find work and places to live. However, what set them apart from other immigrants was that they came to the United States specifically for jobs, not to settle down. Their stay in this foreign land was temporary, and they fully expected to return home when all was said and done. When work started to dry up and anti-Chinese sentiments grew stronger in California, they moved on, looking for other places where they could earn money and goods to send home. For many, that place was the Idaho Territory. The region at that time was largely unmapped and barely surveyed. It's a region of vast arid deserts, rocky hills, and deep river canyons. Traveling through the area was so difficult that most people did not stay long enough to learn the geography. In fact, as Ronald James describes it in his book Ruins of a World, the Snake River Canyon area was so remote and so little known that the General Land Office map of Idaho for 1871 misplaced the Shoshone Falls, placing them below the confluence of the Snake River and Rock Creek, when in fact they are located approximately 8 miles above and east of the mouth of Rock Creek. The unknown factor, people gradually settled down and found work. Gold was discovered in the territory in the early 1860s, and placer mines were quickly established. However, the gold in these mines became increasingly difficult to acquire, so most white miners moved on to easier targets, giving the Chinese an opportunity to move in. At first, there was moderate resistance to their arrival, but after the Orofino district invited the Chinese in to work on deserted claims, other mining settlements followed suit. According to Leonard J. Arrington's History of Idaho, Volume 1, within the next 3 years, Chinese appeared in every mining district in northern Idaho, with as many as 2,000 in the region. Bradbury reports that, by 1870, 6 out of 10 miners in all of Idaho Territory and 8 out of 10 inhabitants in Pierce City were Chinese. The sizable population of Chinese people in the Idaho Territory transformed the culture and economics of the region. Chinese mines pumped gold into the economy that otherwise wouldn't have been found. They grew large vegetable gardens and raised pigs instead of cows. They operated laundries and saloons, and carried useful goods in their general stores that were hard to come by in white-owned businesses. Additionally, because the Chinese population equaled or outnumbered white settlers, they were treated more as equals, and were able to form stronger senses of unity and community. That strong sense of unity and community also allowed them to fight back against targeted crimes and oppression. They made full use of the court system to defend themselves and their property. And if that failed, then they had no qualms about taking the law into their own hands. According to the documentary Gold Mountain Dreams, frontier justice, Chinese style, included late-night arson or a delivery of firewood to an enemy, each log filled with gunpowder. Not all Chinese people who moved to the United States came of their own free will. The state of China was so bad that many families sold their children to merchants and raiders in hopes of getting food, money, or protection from attacks. In the United States, Chinese women were a rare and prized commodity, and as a result, many women were shipped across the oceans to America to work as prostitutes or other forms of servitude. One such girl was Lalu Natoi, better known as Polly Bemis. According to Sister Mary Elsenstone's account of Polly's life, she was born in 1853 in northern China near the Mongolian border. She was traded to brigands in exchange for food, and then sold to an outfit that shipped female slaves to the United States. She was 18 when she arrived in San Francisco. After arriving in America, she was sent up to Portland and bought by a Chinese merchant by the name of Hong King for $2,500. They then moved to Warrens, Idaho when she was 19. Hong King used her as his cook and as a dancing girl for his saloon. Next door to King's saloon was the business of a local merchant named Charlie Bemis. Polly cleaned Bemis's place, and in return, he helped her out whenever she was in trouble. Elsenstone writes, when things got too rough in Hong King's dance hall, Polly used to fly out the back and into Bemis's back door, and he never failed her. His quiet, stern personality, together with his shooting ability, saved Polly from several very threatening situations. At some point, Bemis won ownership of Polly from Hong King in a game of poker. He had her run his boarding house and sell gold trinkets. They later married in 1894, and Polly received her certificate of residence for a Chinese laborer in 1896. For the first time in 23 years, she was a free person. They moved to a property on the Salmon River and ran a small business selling food and ferrying travelers across the river. Polly was treated as a special attraction by the local river guide, Captain Gulicki. He would stop by their place so his clients could meet her. Such guests included Sissy Patterson, the owner of the Washington Times-Herald, and a princess of Norway. Elsenson writes that Mrs. Patterson spoke for Polly's quality and indicated that she was enchanted with her. 5 feet tall, she is brown and wrinkled as a nut, she wrote, and at 69 full of dash and charm. Polly passed away on November 6, 1933 at the age of 80. She was buried in Grangeville, and her possessions are on display at the St. Gertrude's Museum in Cottonwood. To this day, she is remembered in the region as someone who overcame extreme hardships and was beloved by all who met her. Despite all their hard work and large community, the Chinese in Idaho were rarely treated well by their white neighbors. They were frequently abused and called slurs. Many mining communities excluded them from newer or more profitable dig sites. The Idaho territorial government imposed a head tax of $5, about equivalent to approximately $100 in 2022, on every Chinese worker in the territory. Bradbury writes about the account of a Joseph Boyd, whose job was to collect the tax between 1868 and 1869. When he would go down to a claim, the Chinese would run into the woods and hide, and his job was to round them up and extract the tax. If they pleaded poverty, he would march them down in pigtail file down the trail to the store, where they would borrow the required sum from the storekeeper. Money was easily made, quickly spent, and lightly valued, unless, of course, you were Chinese and only had a Chinaman's chance. Violence was an easy way for white people to push back against the yellow peril of the Chinese. Arrington mentions an incident in his book where 5 Chinese men were killed by vigilantes. According to Arrington, in the fall of 1885, a hatchet murder occurred in Pierce City. Suspicions fell on Li Qi Nam. A white vigilante community seized Li, his business partner, and 3 other Chinese. When the local deputy and his small posse rode out with the prisoners, they were intercepted by a lynching party that improvised a gallows and hung the Chinese from a pole lashed between 2 pine trees. A subsequent investigation by Governor Edward A. Stevenson determined that the only action taken by the local citizens seemed appropriate and that the Chinese hanged were probably the ones that committed the murder. Other deadly attacks on the Chinese include a massacre at Rock Springs that killed 28, and another in Hell's Canyon that killed 31. The U.S. government did little to stem the wave of anti-Chinese sentiments. In 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented any further immigration and denied citizenship to any Chinese people and their children in the country, regardless of how long they had been there. Territorial governments also made it illegal for Chinese people to own property and to testify against whites in court. Gradually, through the rest of the 19th century, the Chinese left Idaho. Ronald James discusses some of these factors towards their departure in Ruins of a World. He says, in addition to the anti-Chinese policies, the closing of the frontier, advancements made in mining technology, and the completion of the larger railroad projects of the time left thousands unemployed. Many Chinese moved to larger coastal cities like San Francisco, New York, and Boston, where there were already established Chinese communities and more economic security. Others went back home to China with what they had, unable to get much more from the United States but frosty receptions and threats of harm. The Chinese people that came to the United States, and more specifically to Idaho, took a massive risk. As Charlie Chin put it in Gold Mountain Dreams, I think the most remarkable thing is just the pure courage that these men had to go to places unseen and unknown, unmapped. If they were going to Idaho or Montana, they had no real idea how far it was. They took up jobs that others refused to take, dug in mining spots that white miners gave up on, worked harder than other laborers for less pay, all to support their families back home where they were enduring even worse hardships. They were strangers in a strange land, and they tried their hardest to make the most of the situation in the face of growing hostility. Much of the work they did has faded from recognition, but the impact they made on the American West can still be found if one knows where to look for it. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's stories about people's journeys to California and what they found there. Until next time, this has been The Not So Final Frontier, a podcast created by the History 425 American West class at Lewis Clark State College.